The boy hadn't spoken a word in 3 days. Not to his father, not to the tutors, not even to the chef who made his favorite strawberry pancakes every morning. It was his birthday week. There should have been balloons, a private magician, and the kind of gift that other children could only dream about, the kind of gift only a man worth hundreds of millions could buy. But instead, the 11-year-old sat on the balcony of the penthouse, staring at the gray skyline as if it had stolen something from him. His father, Richard Marlowe, was used to solving problems with money. He could acquire companies before lunch, outbid rivals before dinner, and turn losses into profits with one signature. Yet, here he stood, powerless in his own home. 3 days of silence from his only child, 3 days of wondering what could possibly be so wrong in a boy's life that wealth couldn't fix. That was when the maid entered. Esther, 53 years old, quiet presence, dark skin that had weathered both the Caribbean sun of her youth and the sterile fluorescent light of wealthy households. She'd been with the Marlowes for 4 years, invisible to most guests, overlooked by most staff. She walked into the study without being called. Richard looked up from his desk, irritation flashing in his eyes. This wasn't the moment. But Esther didn't ask permission. She simply said, "Sir, I think I know what's wrong with your boy." And then she said something so simple, so disarmingly gentle, that Richard, the man who had negotiated billion-dollar deals, felt his throat tighten. He didn't know it yet, but that moment, that sentence, was about to change his entire understanding of love, power, and what it truly meant to provide for another human being. Here's the thing about turning points. You rarely see them coming, and when they do come, they don't always look like a deal closing or a courtroom victory. Sometimes, they arrive in the quiet voice of someone the world doesn't think is important. Richard Marlowe wasn't always wealthy. In his 20s, he was the hungry one, the man in borrowed suits, pitching investors who barely looked up from their watches. He fought for every deal, every opportunity, until the fight became his identity. By 42 he had built an empire, luxury hotels, private islands, and a reputation for never losing. But along the way, he traded dinners with his family for dinners with clients. He replaced bedtime stories with overseas calls. His son Matthew grew up surrounded by marble floors and panoramic views, but without the quiet, unhurried presence of a father. Money had bought security, comfort, even prestige, but it had also built walls, invisible ones, between father and son. Matthew had everything except the one thing that couldn't be outsourced: connection. Esther noticed it long before this silent standoff began. She'd see Matthew wander the halls like a ghost in his own home. The boy had learned early that his father's attention came in short, distracted bursts, the way sunlight filters briefly through a moving cloud. What Richard didn't know was that Matthew's silence wasn't about any single event. It was the accumulation of years, moments missed, conversations never started, questions never asked. Esther had seen this before. In another life, in another country, she had been a teacher. Before immigration papers and long shifts in other people's homes, she taught children who had nothing, no shoes, no toys, no secure tomorrow. Yet somehow they smiled, they laughed, they trusted. And she had learned something unshakable. Children don't measure love in gifts or square footage. They measure it in presence. That was the hidden currency Matthew was starving for, and it was the one currency Richard had unknowingly withheld. Esther didn't just suspect this, she felt it in her bones. And she knew, if she could get Richard to see it, the boy's silence would break. But there was a problem. Richard Marlowe was a man who listened to strategies, not feelings, facts, not sentiment. If she wanted him to hear her, she'd have to speak in a language he understood, the language of results. She didn't know it yet, but the way she would do that would be the beginning of a transformation neither man in that house saw coming. Richard leaned back in his leather chair, arms folded. He had heard hundreds of people claim to know what's wrong in his empire, advisors, analysts, even relatives, but never his maid. "You think you know my son better than I do?" he asked, his tone sharper than intended. Esther didn't flinch. She stood steady, her hands clasped loosely in front of her apron. "I don't know your business, sir, but I know children." Something in the way she said it unsettled him. There was no defiance, no attempt to challenge his authority, just a calm certainty that didn't need his approval. He could dismiss her. That was the safe choice, the expected choice. After all, what could a maid possibly teach a man whose name was printed on the covers of financial magazines? But something else stirred inside him, a quieter voice he rarely listened to. What if she's right? The truth was, Richard had been carrying a private fear he never admitted, not to his board, not to his friends, not even to himself on most days. The fear that one day, his son would stop trying to reach him altogether, that the silence in their home wasn't a phase, it was the beginning of a permanent distance. Esther watched him wrestle with it, and then almost as if she could see through the armor of his confidence, she said, "You have more power than anyone in this city, except where it matters most. Let me help you before it sits too late." The room seemed to shrink around him. If he said yes, it meant admitting, even if only to himself, that his way had failed, that his money, his strategy, his relentless work ethic, had built a future for his son, but not a bond with him. If he said no, he could maintain control, pride intact, the world would never know, but neither would his son. That was the fork in the road, not a headline decision, not a boardroom vote, just a quiet choice in the middle of a weekday, one that would ripple through the rest of their lives. Richard opened his mouth to speak. Richard Sepp's voice was low. "All right, Esther, I've been listening." She nodded once, not in triumph, but in quiet acknowledgement. Then she moved closer to the desk, placing a small object on the polished wood between them. It was an old frayed deck of cards. Richard frowned. "What is this? Some kind of game?" "Not a game, sir," she said, her voice steady. "A bridge." She picked up the deck and began to shuffle with practiced ease, her hands moving like water, smooth, deliberate, rhythmic. Richard found himself watching, not because he cared about cards, but because her movements carried a strange gravity. "I used to play this with my students back home," she began. "Every day after lessons we sit in a circle, no screens, no fancy boards, just cards. It wasn't set about winning, it was about being there together, learning how someone thinks, how they feel, even when they stare quiet." She dealt 4 piles on the desk. The soft slap of the cards broke the heavy silence between them. "Your son doesn't need a gift, sir. He needs a bridge, something that makes him feel seen without being asked to perform, something that gives him your attention, without making him feel like an appointment." Richard tried to brush it off. "And you think a few games will solve years of—" "Not games, moments," she interrupted gently. "The kind he set's been missing, the kind you can sit by, but you can give if you know how." He stared at the cards. A single action flipped the entire outcome in a negotiation. He knew that from business. Could it be the same with his son? One deliberate act, repeated enough times, changing the entire course of their relationship. "What exactly do you want me to do?" he asked. Esther smiled faintly. "Not yet. First you have to see what Sepp's really missing. That Sepp's the trick, sir. If you see it, the rest will come easy." Her words felt both cryptic and undeniable. Richard wasn't used to someone telling him not to act immediately. In his world, hesitation meant weakness. But here in this quiet study, hesitation suddenly felt like strategy. What Richard didn't know was that before the week was over, the deck of cards would be sitting in Matthew's hands, and the first crack in his silence would appear. 2 days later, Richard decided to act. He waited until after dinner, when Matthew was scrolling silently through his tablet at the long dining table. Richard placed the deck of cards on the table. "Thought maybe we could play a game tonight," he said casually. Matthew did not even look up. "I'm busy." Richard forced a smile. "Just 1 round, 10 minutes, you pick the game." Matthew shrugged, eyes still glued to the screen. "No thanks." The rejection hit harder than it should have. In business, Richard could shrug off a no with ease. But here, in his own home, it felt personal. He tried again the next night, and the next, each time, met with a wall of polite disinterest or complete silence. On the 4th night, things got worse. Richard had invited a few high-profile friends for a charity planning meeting. Matthew was supposed to greet the guests, say a few words, and then leave for bed. But when the moment came, Matthew walked into the living room, glanced around at the well-dressed crowd, and turned right back out without saying a word. The awkward silence that followed was deafening. Someone muttered, "Kids these days," and laughter bubbled up, half joking, half critical. Richard felt the heat rise in his face. He covered with a joke, but inside, humiliation gnawed at him. His son's silence was no longer just a private frustration. It had become a public failure. Later that night, in the kitchen, Richard slammed the deck of cards on the counter. "It's not working," he told Esther. "You were wrong." She didn't flinch. She simply picked up the deck, straightened the cards, and said, "You stir playing the wrong game." Richard snapped. "I've been not here to play games." "Neither is he," Esther replied. "And that sips the point. You came to him like a businessman trying to close a deal. He doesn't want a deal. He wants a father." The words landed with a sting. For the first time in years, Richard didn't have a comeback. He stood there, silent, as Esther walked away, the sound of her footsteps fading into the quiet. In that moment, Richard wasn't sure if he was angry at her, or at himself. That night Richard didn't sleep. He sat in his study long after midnight, the city lights stretching out like a restless sea. His mind kept replaying Esther's words. He doesn't want a deal, he wants a father. It was such a simple truth, yet it cut through him like a blade. For years Richard had believed that providing more meant loving better, that if Matthew had everything he never did, happiness would follow naturally. But the boy had grown up in a fortress of comfort, and somehow, still felt alone. By sunrise Richard knew what he had to do. Not another gesture, not another half-hearted attempt between meetings, but a complete shift in the way he approached his son. At breakfast, he found Esther already in the kitchen, humming softly as she packed Matthew's lunch. "All right," he said quietly, "tell me the trick." She didn't look up. "It set's not really a trick, sir. It set's a practice. You give him 1 hour, every day. No phone, no laptop, no staff interrupting. Just you and him, doing something that belongs to both of you." Richard frowned. "An hour, every day? You know my schedule." "I know his childhood one. Sit wait for your schedule," she said, finally meeting his eyes, and neither will his trust. He wanted to argue, wanted to list the deals, the deadlines, the empire that depended on his attention, but the truth was, none of that would matter if his own son stopped needing him. "So, just an hour. Doing anything?" he asked. Esther smiled faintly. "Not anything, something he chooses, something where you can lose, so he can see you as human. Not the man in the suit, not the name on the building, just, Dad." The simplicity of it disarmed him. It wasn't about cards or games, those were just tools. The real method was consistency, presence, vulnerability. "And you think that's enough to bring him back?" he asked. "I don't think, sir. I seen it." Richard left the kitchen with the deck of cards in one hand, but this time they weren't a solution he was trying to push. They were simply a bridge, waiting to be built. And for the first time in years, he was ready to start construction. Richard started that very evening. He found Matthew in the den, curled up with his tablet. No preamble this time, no pitch to convince him. Richard simply sat down on the floor, not across the room, not towering over him, but at his level, and began shuffling the cards. He didn't say play with me, he just dealt himself a hand, then dealt one in front of the empty chair across from him. At first, Matthew ignored him. 10 minutes passed in silence. Then without looking up, the boy muttered, "You stirred dealing it wrong." Richard hid his smile. "Then show me the right way." It was the smallest crack in the wall, but it was there. The next night, it was checkers. The night after that, chess. One evening Matthew surprised him by asking, "Ever played Uno?" And for the first time in months, Richard heard his son's voice hold a trace of playfulness. They didn't talk about feelings. They didn't rehash old arguments. They just played, and in the spaces between turns, little fragments of conversation began to surface. "We had a substitute teacher today. I hate broccoli. You work too much." That last one stung, but Richard didn't defend himself. He just nodded, took his turn, and let the moment breathe. Esther never hovered, never interfered, but she noticed, the boy's laughter, faint at first, grew easier. The way his eyes met his father's for longer than a second, the way Richard's own posture softened, as if the weight on his shoulders had shifted, not gone, but no longer crushing. Weeks passed. Friends noticed Richard was leaving the office earlier. His assistant learned not to schedule calls during the hour. And for once, Richard didn't treat it as a sacrifice. It felt like an investment, one that was already paying quiet dividends. But change, even good change, rarely comes without a test. And that test was about to arrive, in front of an audience much larger than the two of them. It happened at the annual Marlowe Foundation Gala, the same event where a year earlier, Matthew had slipped away without a word, leaving Richard embarrassed in front of his peers. The ballroom was a glittering showcase of influence. CEOs, diplomats, celebrities, the kind of crowd where every handshake was a transaction. Richard had planned to let Matthew skip the event entirely this year, but 3 days before the boy surprised him. "I'll come if we play after." Richard agreed instantly. When the evening arrived, Matthew stood beside him in a simple navy blazer, no forced smile, just a calm presence. As the speeches began, Richard felt the familiar weight of expectation pressing on him. This was the moment where he would typically take the stage alone. But when his name was called, Matthew tugged at his sleeve. "Can I say something first?" The request hit him like a jolt. A year ago, the boy wouldn't speak in a room of 3 strangers. Now he wanted a microphone in front of hundreds. Richard handed it to him without hesitation. Matthew stepped up to the podium, glancing at the crowd with the ease of someone who knew exactly where his anchor was, his father, standing just behind him. "Last year, I didn't want to be here," he began. "I didn't really want to be anywhere my dad was." A ripple of surprise moved through the audience. Richard felt the air tighten, but he stayed still. "But then, we started playing games. Cards, chess, stuff like that, and I realized something. My dad, he sits actually pretty fun when he sits not working." Laughter broke the tension. "So, I guess I just want to say, thanks Dad, for showing up, for real this time. It wasn't polished, it wasn't rehearsed, but it was honest, and in that moment it carried more weight than any award Richard had ever received. The applause was loud, but Richard barely heard it. All he could hear was the sound of his son's voice, clear, steady, and directed at him. For the first time, the richest man in the room wasn't thinking about what he owned, but who he was becoming. After the gala, the congratulations came in waves. Guests shook Richard's hand, not to discuss business or deals but to praise Matthew, his presence, his confidence, his honesty. A few even admitted, with quiet envy, that they wished their own children would say something like that about them. But the biggest shift happened outside the spotlight. In the days that followed, Richard noticed subtle changes at home. Matthew would drop by his study just to say hi. They still played cards and chess, but now their conversations drifted into other territory. Books, music, things Matthew was curious about. And sometimes, silence. But not the cold, closed-off kind. This was the comfortable quiet of two people who didn't need to fill the air to feel connected. Richard's staff noticed too. The man who once barked orders while glancing at his watch now lingered in the kitchen in the mornings. The man who used to leave before sunrise now sometimes stayed to eat breakfast with his son. The boardroom also began to feel different. Richard was still sharp, still decisive, but there was a new patience in him, a willingness to listen without rushing toward a solution. His executives didn't know it, but they were witnessing the side effects of a father learning to be present. And then there was Esther. Richard called her into his study one afternoon. She assumed it was about scheduling or household logistics. Instead, he slid a small envelope across the desk. "This isn't set payment," he said. "It's such acknowledgement. You didn't set just help me reach my son. You changed the way I see him, and myself." Inside was a letter, handwritten, thanking her for seeing what he couldn't, and a scholarship fund in her name, dedicated to training educators in under-resourced communities. Esther didn't cry often, but that day she did. It was redemption in a way, for the years she had spent teaching children far from her own home, for the sacrifices that had brought her here. She had passed along the same lessons she once gave to her students, that being seen was the beginning of transformation. But perhaps the most telling sign came one Saturday morning, when Richard walked into the living room to find Matthew and Esther already at the table, deep into a game of you-know. "Mind if I join?" Richard asked. Matthew grinned. "Only if you sit ready to lose." And just like that, the man who once measured his worth in deals, now measured it in hours like these. In the years that followed, the Marlowe name still appeared in headlines. But now, some of those stories had nothing to do with mergers or market gains. They were about father-son charity tournaments, community programs, and quiet gestures no press release could fully capture. The empire didn't shrink, the deals still happened, but they were no longer the only thing Richard fought for. Matthew grew into a young man with his own ambitions, some that aligned with his father's world, and some that didn't, but the foundation between them held. The silence that once defined their relationship had been replaced with something stronger than constant conversation: trust. And Esther? She eventually returned to teaching, funded by the scholarship program that bore her name. She didn't see herself as the hero of the story. She simply believed that the right presence, at the right moment, can alter the entire trajectory of a life. Here sits what that moment teaches us. The greatest wealth you can give someone is not what you can buy for them, but the part of your life you choose to share with them. Money can build walls or bridges, and the difference lies in whether you show up when it matters most. A single action flipped the entire outcome for Richard and his son. Not a grand gesture, not an expensive gift, just one uninterrupted hour, repeated over time, until it became a habit, and then, a bond. So here sits the quiet challenge. Look at the relationships in your life. Where have you tried to replace presence with provision? And what would happen if, starting today, you chose consistency over convenience? If this story resonated with your values, like, comment, and subscribe, not because it helps the channel, but because it tells the world that these are the stories that matter. The ones that remind us that no amount of wealth can match the value of being truly seen.